Hi, I'm Scott and welcome back to my mini wood shop. Today, we're going to turn a sphere out of a piece of walnut by hand. Keep watching. So I'm starting out with this piece of walnut. This is just a 3" by 3" by 3" cube. And we're going to use this center finder and locate the center. Alright, so some people ask how come I do all four sides with the center finder, and you can see that they don't all converge in the dead center, but there's a little square that's created by the four lines that is the dead center. Okay, the next step is to get your piece mounted in the lathe. I have it mounted between centers. And I'm using those lines that I drew as a guide. Now you could center punch those lines and then just pop them into the points on your lathe, but I just kind of eyeballed it. Alright, now that we have the piece mounted on the lathe between the centers, I'm going to move the rest into position, make sure it clears the rest. And we're going to turn these corners away and turn this into a cylinder using a spindle roughing gouge. Now that we have this turned into a cylinder, we're going to use a caliper and we're going to measure the diameter of the cylinder. Okay, so you want this caliper to just barely make it over there. All right, and that'll give us the diameter. Now I'm going to take a pencil and I'm just going to kind of mark a line on the edge with the lathe running to give me a boundary line. And now I'm going to take my caliper and I'm going to measure over and mark a spot where that caliper touches the edge. Alright, and I'm going to take my pencil and we're going to do the same thing we just did. The lathe on. Okay, so there's my two boundaries. Now the distance between those two lines is about the same as the diameter, so that'll be our sphere. And these are just going to be the edges. All right, so we're going to define those edges and we're going to use a parting tool to take that wood down. Boy, that did a terrible job, didn't it? I'm going to need to sharpen this parting tool. Alright, now that we got that cleaned up, the next step is to mark the center of our sphere. So I have this handy center marking ruler. Alright, so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of put this so we have just about the same on each side. And you can see we have 1 and a little bit over 1 1/4 and a little bit over 1 1/4. All right. And then we'll take our pencil and we'll mark that center line. And there we go. The next step will be to take away these corners and kind of give this a spherical shape. Doesn't have to be perfect, you know, but we definitely want to get rid of this wood and get it as close to a sphere as we can. So there we go. I mean, it's not perfect. It's not bad by doing it by eye, but we want to get this to be as perfect a sphere as we can, so let's continue on to the next step. Alright, so I have these pretty close together for now, so just so you can see what I'm doing. I put my chuck on the lathe. I have this piece of cherry that I use as a cup center. And this is just a regular piece of cherry. I put a tenon on it. I marked where it lines up with jaw number 1, so I can always put it back in the chuck exactly in the same spot when I take it off. And then I just kind of shaped this to, you know, have the end protrude a little bit, and then just shaped a little bit of a depression in there, or a cup. So when we take the sphere, it kind of self-centers into the cup. Alright, so you get the idea. Alright, now you can see the view on the other side, and this is basically the same type of deal, right? This is just a piece of, I believe this is maple, but I took this piece of maple and I just kind of cut it into like a cone shape, and I dished out the top. Actually, this is drilled all the way through, and I mounted an O-ring on it. And then this is threaded, so it threads onto the end of my live center. Alright, so you can see how that's all working in there, right? Just threads on the end of my live center. And you can do the same thing with just a piece that slides over the end, okay? And just make sure you have like a little bit of depression in there, so it kind of centers onto the, you know, the curvature of the sphere. You know? Or if you want to get fancy, you can put an O-ring on it. Alright, so now I have the piece mounted here in the lathe. And you can see I got to turn these stubs away. So what I'm going to wind up doing is I'm going to take my spindle gouge and I'm going to turn the lathe on. And when I have the lathe running, you'll be able to see where the stubs are, but you'll also be able to see the line that's created by the wood, and it's going to create the sphere. So you'll see what I'm talking about when I turn the lathe on, but it's going to be loud and I don't want to talk over the lathe, so let's take a look.
Okay, now that we have the piece spinning on the lathe, I mean, you can pretty clearly see the shadow that's created by the two nubs that were left on from turning between centers. You can also clearly see the curvature of the sphere and where we have to cut those nubs down to. And what's not really evident in the video, but I can see while I'm turning this on the lathe, is there's a very thin shadow line that's being created by all the irregularities from where the sphere isn't perfectly round. So I'll be using the gouge to cut away at that shadow and get that curve almost as perfect as I possibly can. As I'm shaping the sphere here, I'm actually using those nubs as almost like an index. So I make sure when I rotate the sphere, I rotate it on each of the 3 axes of the sphere. So that way I can make sure that I cut the piece evenly. A little bit later on in the video, I'll talk about how to deal with that once those nubs are gone.
Okay, so those stubs are gone, and you can see that I was using the wing of that gouge as a shear scraper. And I was kind of turning away any of the surface irregularities. So now what we're going to do is we're going to reposition this piece. Alright? We're going to turn it 90 degrees, and we're going to do that again.
Okay, so here I've rotated that piece into axis number 2. And I'm going to turn away any of that shadow that I still see while it's spinning, and I'm gonna use a combination of cutting and scraping to try to get that as refined as I possibly can. Alright, so the video's sped up here, and I'm just kind of pointing out the low spots and some areas that still need to be smoothed out. So I've rotated this now to axis number 3, and we're just going to continue like before and just smoothing out any of the bumps. And so here we go back to axis number 1, and we're just going to keep refining it until we get rid of all the low spots.
Okay, so you can see I have this one little persistent area I cut in a little bit too deep here. Okay, so we're just going to have to keep this rotate, cut until we have that smoothed out. All right, so we have all that's pretty much gone at this point, right? All right, so now that we have that pretty much nearly perfectly round, to just tweak it, what we have to do is we have to rotate that on all 3 axes, all right? And we have to make sure we set up a pattern so we continually rotate the piece on the axes, or the axes, I guess is how you would say it. All right, so you can see how I lined up this piece, right? So the grain runs pretty much in line with the spindle. All right, so this is going to be my first position. All right, and my second position is going to be 90 degrees, but with the grain still lined up in line with the spindle. All right, and then we'll do a little bit of refinement here. And then the last position will be with the face grain in the cups. So the grain is running perpendicular to the spindle. So that way I'll make sure I hit every one of the 3 axes, all right? And I don't repeat any, all right? So we want to keep this thing as round as possible. We have to pretty much use that pattern. So let's start here. So to do these refining cuts, okay, I'm just really kind of feeling for any irregularities or bumps, and I'm just kind of using a shear scrape with my spindle gouge. And you could do the same thing using like a flat shear scraper, or in this case a skew. I have a burr rolled onto the end of this skew, but I'll show you what I'm talking about. So you can see I'm just kind of refining that. I'm trying to just remove any bumps and irregularities or high spots. And I'm just using, my skew as a scraper.
Alright, so now you can see that I've gone back to my spindle gouge, and I'm just using the wings just to barely touch the wood and just feel for any bumps or irregularities and try to smooth out that surface as best I can. And I'll just continue to do that same thing on all 3 axes of the piece.
All right, so that's about as good as I'm going to get it using those tools, and it's pretty close to being perfectly spherical. Okay, so here we have our sphere turned. Just needs to be sanded, and to sand it, we're going to do the same thing as we did before. All right, we're going to put it in between our cup centers, and we're going to line the grain up so it's kind of in line with the spindle. And I'm going to take some 120 grit, and we'll start sanding with the 120.
Sanding's pretty boring, so I've sped this up quite a bit. But the piece was sanded with each grit on all 3 axes up to 400.
All right, so here you can see we got the piece sanded up to 400. Let's pop it out of there. It's got some dust on it. But you can see we got a perfect sphere. Here, let me turn the light off. Look a little bit better. There we go. All that's left is to put on your favorite finish and then maybe polish it up. So here we got you a perfect sphere. This one's all nice and polished. This was the one that I showed when we started the video. And here's the one we just finished turning. Unfinished, right? So here's both of them together. They're about the same size. So it really isn't all that difficult, I don't think. It's just really is a matter of setting up the, I shouldn't be scratching my face. It's really just a matter of setting up the sphere on the jig so you have the grain lined up, you know, with the spindle, and then rotating it 90 degrees so it is also still with the spindle, but it's just a separate axis, and then rotating it so the grain's perpendicular. If you remember that pattern, and then you do that when you're cutting it, shaping it, and doing the refinements, and then when you're sanding, I mean, it should all pretty much work out. So, so there you go. A sphere from a piece of walnut turned by hand. And then, all right, so I'm ready for the comments. So then we have 2 spheres, right? Made from some walnut, right? So I hope you liked the video. Oh man, I just can't stop laughing. I hope you liked the video. If you did, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. I really would appreciate it. That'd be great. And just remember, I mean, I'm just the average guy with an average shop. I mean, my shop's probably smaller than most of yours. So if I can do it in my shop, you can do it in yours. So hopefully I'll see you next time in Scott's Mini Wood Shop. Have a great day.